Well, I think that we can all agree that no, we're not taking questions at this time. I think that we can all agree that the perspectives that everybody has brought really gives a very well-rounded approach to understanding not only the historical significance at the time, but also its impact these 100 years later. The British barrister and legal academic Norman Bentvich wrote that the Balfour Declaration was, and I quote, "not an impetus or sentimental act of the British government, as has been sometimes represented, or a calculated measure of political warfare. It was a deliberate decision of British policy, idealist politics, weighed and reweighed, and adopted only after full consultation with the United States and other nations." And we will take questions afterwards. Our enemies, unfortunately, and Colonel Kemp has referred to the apology campaign that was launched, they're using the Balfour Declaration to reduce the Zionist claims to nothing more than this letter and ignoring 100 years of our nationhood, which of course the United Nations is doing simultaneously, denouncing the Balfour Declaration and Israel as racist, imperialist, colonialist, and evil. Considering your comments today and your wealth of knowledge on not only the history but the current relevance of the Declaration, how do you believe that Jewish leadership and the general Jewish population and the world could respond to these claims, or should respond to these claims? I open it up to anyone who is interested, as you are. Edwin, why don't you go ahead and start.
Can I just say I don't think anyone should respond to those claims in the same way as I don't ever believe that anybody should attempt to justify the existence of the Jewish state.
Is this working?
Click the button right in front of you on the microphone.
Click the button.
How about now? Good. Well, the most important weapon we have in legitimacy and truth is fact. And history is now being rewritten. It's being abducted, subducted, and redacted. And the only way to steal our future is to kidnap our history. So if you want to know what we can do and what Jewish leaders can do, school yourself on the facts. I don't like panels, but this is the most precious panel I've ever been on. Thank you very much to all of my colleagues. Now, I would just like to say in the 20 seconds I have left, to Mr. Dormant, who made his remarks about BDS and occupation, I will pay for the coffee, and I will be happy to explain to you who are the indigenous people of Israel, and that would be the Jewish Canaanites. I will be happy to explain to you what is occupation and what is not occupation, and I'll be happy to explain to you that prior to May of 1964, no Arab called himself a Palestinian until the KGB cooked up the PLO. When you're ready for that coffee, let me know. I'm there for you.
What about the meal?
The meal?
Milk.
The milk? Ken, milk echet.
Would anyone else like to respond? So shall we continue? Put in a larger context of the historical developments in the region, do you think that there's anything that has happened in the last 100 years that would have made the Balfour Declaration implementable in a more positive manner? Colonel Kemp addressed some of the negative failures of the British government, and we must also include, by the way, the very unique history of the Exodus ship. For those of you who don't know, the ship of Jews that was sent back to Germany, and they later were not even allowed back into the land until 1948. And there was a very violent interaction between the survivors of the Holocaust and the British Army. So there have been all of these historical events over this last 100 years. What do you think could have been or could be the next steps to ensure that the implementation of the Balfour Declaration remains historically relevant even for the future?
Well, I think one of the problems in the implementation up until this point, and continues to be a problem, is what we call here Arabis in the State Department. And these are people who were highly influenced by the British Foreign Office in the 30s and 40s, who had the view that the most important thing was to guarantee the supply of oil. And secondarily, some were anti-Semites, some were afraid Jews were Bolshevists, and that would be a problem if they had their own state. And throughout the Cold War, there was the concern that support for Israel would allow the Soviets to expand their influence in the Middle East. That's still a problematic view that is held by many key officials in the U.S. government. We saw it throughout the Obama administration, where people had this view that the Palestinian issue was the single most important issue, that what happens to what the Jews do in Israel somehow undermines our influences or our interests elsewhere. I think the good news is that with the change in the oil resources of the United States, that we're less dependent on foreign oil, and there's a greater recognition, I think, within this administration that the Palestinian issue isn't the be-all and end-all, that we have other more significant strategic interests, that there's a chance that there will be a greater focus on the original intent of the Balfour Declaration to strengthen the Jewish homeland in Palestine, or Jewish homeland now in Israel.
Thank you. Baroness Deech.
Well, I just bought an electric car. I'm doing my bit towards ending the need for Middle Eastern oil. The problem we have in Britain, I think it's not the same here, is our leadership of the Jewish community, which stifles the grassroots. It's been very striking when there have been crises for Israel, like the Gaza war 2 or 3 years ago, that our leadership, so-called, kept their heads down, talked about quiet diplomacy, whereas the grassroots were actually meeting together and speaking out. And I want to pay tribute, I didn't have time before, to my friend here, Colonel Kemp, because when we most needed defense, when everyone was saying Israel is disproportionate in the force that it is using in Gaza, when we have these terrible bloodthirsty programs saying 20,000 Gazans have been killed, but only 200 Israelis, this is quite wrong. Richard Kemp would step forward and point out how Israel had the most moral army in the world, how Israel went to incredible, almost suicidal lengths to avoid harming people. He explained how when ammunition was hidden in hospitals and children's homes, that's why people got killed. And we need more voices like his, instead of the really rather low-key voices that we have from our so-called Jewish community leaders.
We'll have one more comment, then we will have one more final question for our panel to wrap up. Edwin?
Just to add on to Mitch's important comment about oil, and to string that to Colonel Kemp's comment about appeasement. What was the nature of that appeasement? Well, the nature of that appeasement was that at the very same moment, in the very same building in San Remo, when the San Remo mandates were being announced, the oil companies had propounded their agreement with the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, now known as British Petroleum, to string pipelines from Iraq right through to Haifa and right across through from Lebanon. And the Arabs revolted against that. And when they lost Syria, that's when they invented the term Nakba, not as Mr. Dormant thinks in 1948, but in 1924. And Winston Churchill had to bomb them with Bomber Harris, who later went to Dresden. Oil is the key. The best way to peace in the Middle East is for everybody to butt out and let the parties find their own shakshuka, find their own pen, find their own paper, get together and work it out the way Faisal and Weitzman did in Eilat in 1919 in the presence of Lawrence of Arabia.
Thank you very much. And our final question, we did have hope that we would have time to open up to questions from the audience, and we do apologize that in the interest of time, but I think you'll agree that the visits by the congressmen are well worth it. So speaking of diplomacy, Abba Eban once said that the Balfour Declaration stands alone as the decisive diplomatic victory of the Jewish people in modern history. that has been unreplicated for any nation anywhere else in the world. And at the Balfour Centenary event that took place in London, Theresa May, Prime Minister Theresa May, recently remarked that the Balfour remains unfinished business. How would you interpret this as an impetus for the next steps of the world, for the world, both Jewish and non? And if I might add, what would you add to the Balfour Declaration? At a presentation of Colonel Kemp by the JCPA in Israel this summer, he had made a comment about how we need a declaration for the next 100 years. Coincidentally, the Balfour Initiative of the Israel Forever Foundation has fostered such a declaration, which many of the organizations represented here are partner organizations, and of which Colonel Kemp is also involved. So what would you add as well to the declaration for the next 100 years and onward? And these will be our closing remarks for the day.
I would say just that the city of Jerusalem should be the united, undivided, eternal capital of Israel and recognized by Great Britain, the United States, and all other countries around the world as such.
I would, I think I'd just like to add to something that Elana said just a moment ago, which I'm not in the habit of coming to a different country and bashing my own country, but I think it's important that we're upfront about this. But she mentioned the Exodus, and I was at an anniversary event to commemorate the Exodus recently in Israel, in Haifa. And I met a man who had been a boy on board the Exodus when it sailed from France to Palestine and was intercepted by the British, and then the people on the Exodus were then not shipped to Cyprus, they were shipped back to France, where they came from, as a punishment. And then they refused to get off in France, and so the British Foreign Secretary ordered the ships to be taken to Germany. And these were all Holocaust survivors, mainly from Auschwitz. And they were to be taken back to Germany. And this one man that I met, not only did he go back to Hamburg and was unloaded at Hamburg, he was taken by the British Army and imprisoned in Belsen by the British Army, someone who was a Holocaust survivor. Quite incredible. Sorry?
Aryeh Itamar.
Right, that was it.
Aryeh Itamar.
To answer the question directly, I think what needs to be added now is, the Balfour Declaration shouldn't be forgotten, but it's now pretty much history. We've now got a flourishing, highly advanced democratic state. But what needs to be, I think, the unfinished business to me is there must be no more land concessions made by Israel. What Israel has now, Israel should keep. There needs to be a way found, and there are solutions to this problem, there needs to be a way found to prevent future conflict between the Arabs, between the Palestinians and the Israelis, if possible. That probably comes from maybe a combination of allocation of different land and also wider accord with the Arab world. And there are countries now, as you all know, who are more inclined to make an accord with Israel. They're not going to fall in love with the Jews, but their mutual interest will cause them, I think, to come to some form of accord with Israel in some cases, and that might add pressure. They might add pressure to the Palestinians on that side. But I think that's the key thing, is that Israel is what it is. It's not anything like what was envisaged by Balfour. Balfour never survived to see the 1939 White Paper. We need to make sure it doesn't get any further eroded in terms of land concessions. That's obviously Israel's decision because they've got control. It's purely advisory.
An Arab and an Israeli went to see God, and they said, God Almighty, you know everything. Tell us, is there going to be a peaceful, harmonious solution to the Arab-Israel issue? And God said, yes, he said. There will be peace. There will be harmony. There will be a solution, but not in my lifetime.
Okay. The finest thing we can do to ensure the continuity of the Balfour Declaration in the future is, as Elana said, is to proclaim a reaffirmation of the Balfour. I know Elana has been doing this, and this is my 13th event around the country, and I have had leaders in every city sign a declaration and proclamation re-endorsing the Balfour Declaration. So the best way to make sure the Balfour Declaration of Peace is achieved is to scrape away all the falsities about the history, all the falsities about the facts, and all the falsities about the status of the parties in the area, and get to truth. And that truth includes the truth about international law. And I'm afraid that Elana, even though she went back to Cyrus, and I, who went back a great deal, failed to give the original statute of international law. And that international law is, go forth and spread liberty throughout the land. And that piece of international law was Leviticus 25:10. Thank you very much.